The open roads of the American highway system have long represented freedom, mobility, and the endless possibilities of the sprawling landscape. For decades, the interstate has been the lifeblood of commerce and travel, connecting distant cities through ribbons of asphalt that cut through dense forests, arid deserts, and quiet rural counties. But beneath the romanticized vision of the open road lies a stark and unsettling reality. The highway is also a place of profound isolation. Once a vehicle leaves the safety of the city limits, it enters a transient world where anonymity reigns, and the protective gaze of communities and neighborhoods fades away. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the highways of Central Florida became the backdrop for one of the most complex and unprecedented investigations in the history of American law enforcement. It was a case that would challenge the conventional wisdom of behavioral profiling, redefine the way multiple jurisdictions collaborated, and ultimately rely on meticulous forensic science to bring an elusive perpetrator to justice. The tragic sequence of events began to unfold in December of 1989, though investigators would not immediately recognize the scale of the crisis facing their communities. In a remote, wooded area of Volusia County, Florida, law enforcement officers were dispatched to investigate a suspicious discovery near a dirt road. The scene they encountered was somber and required immediate, careful processing. They found the remains of a middle-aged man, later identified through dental records and fingerprint analysis as Richard Mallory. Richard was a 51-year-old electronics repairman, a veteran, and a man deeply embedded in his local community. His sudden disappearance had left his friends and family searching for answers, hoping for a safe return. The forensic evaluation of the scene and the subsequent medical examination revealed that Richard had sustained fatal ballistic injuries. The evidence indicated that a .22 caliber firearm had been used. At this early stage, detectives treated the case as an isolated incident, a tragic robbery gone wrong, as Richard's vehicle, a 1977 Cadillac, was missing, along with his personal belongings. There was no immediate reason to suspect that his passing was the opening chapter of a much larger, systemic threat to public safety. However, the illusion of an isolated incident began to shatter in the late spring of 1990. In June, the remains of a second individual were discovered in an isolated area of Citrus County, hidden away from the main thoroughfares. The victim was identified as David Spears, a 43-year-old heavy equipment operator. David was known for his strong work ethic and his dedication to his profession. He had been traveling to visit family in Orlando when his journey was tragically cut short. Forensic analysts determined that David, like Richard Mallory, had suffered fatal injuries inflicted by a .22 caliber weapon. His truck was found abandoned miles away along Interstate 75. The condition of the scene and the methodology of the crime mirrored the Mallory case in subtle but undeniable ways. Less than a week later, the situation escalated from a concerning coincidence to a clear and present danger. A third victim was found in Pasco County. Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old rodeo worker, had been traveling from his home to a new job opportunity. He was a man who loved the outdoors and the nomadic lifestyle of the rodeo circuit, leaving behind grieving relatives who were completely baffled by his sudden and violent end. The forensic pathology report confirmed the grim reality. Charles had also been the victim of a .22 caliber firearm. His vehicle, a 1989 vehicle, was discovered abandoned in a completely different county, stripped of any valuable items. The discovery of Charles Carskadden triggered a massive shift in the law enforcement response. 3 men, all traveling alone along the Florida highway corridors, all separated from their vehicles, and all having sustained fatal injuries from the same caliber of weapon. The similarities were too significant to ignore. The behavioral sciences unit was consulted, and the profiles generated suggested an offender who was highly mobile, comfortable operating along the interstate system, and utilizing the cover of the transient highway environment to select victims and evade detection. Investigators recognized that they were not dealing with random acts of violence, but rather a calculated and methodical series of crimes. This realization led to the formation of a multi-agency task force, bringing together detectives from Volusia, Citrus, Pasco, and Marion counties, along with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The creation of the task force was a monumental logistical challenge. In 1990, interagency communication was not as seamless as it is in the modern digital age. Detectives had to manually share case files, coordinate suspect lists, and compare forensic notes across jurisdictional lines. The primary objective was to establish a clear timeline of the victims' movements prior to their disappearance, and to identify any common denominators. The working theory was that the perpetrator was either hitchhiking or posing as a stranded motorist, using the inherent helpfulness of passing drivers to gain access to their vehicles. As the summer progressed, the community anxiety reached a fever pitch. The media began to cover the unsolved cases extensively, broadcasting warnings to motorists traveling along Interstate 75 and Interstate 4. The highway, once a symbol of freedom, became a corridor of fear. Families urged their loved ones to avoid traveling alone at night and to never pull over for strangers under any circumstances. Despite the heightened awareness, the tragedy continued to unfold. In early July, a profound breakthrough occurred, though it stemmed from yet another heartbreaking loss. Peter Seams, a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman, left his home in Florida, intending to drive to Arkansas to visit his relatives. Peter was a devoted grandfather and a deeply religious man who spent his retirement engaged in community service. When he failed to arrive at his destination, his family immediately contacted the authorities. While Peter remained missing, a crucial piece of evidence materialized in Orange Springs, Florida. A vehicle matching the description of Peter's 1988 Pontiac Sunbird was involved in a single-car collision. Witnesses at the scene of the accident reported seeing two women emerge from the wrecked vehicle. The women appeared uninjured but were highly agitated. When the witnesses approached to offer assistance, the two women quickly fled the scene on foot, abandoning the vehicle. This moment provided the task force with their most significant lead to date. For the first time, investigators had eyewitness accounts of individuals directly connected to a victim's property. Law enforcement worked closely with the witnesses to develop composite sketches of the two women. The sketches were distributed across the state, and the narrative shifted. The task force was now looking for female suspects, a demographic reality that challenged the traditional behavioral profiles of highway serial offenders, which historically pointed toward male perpetrators. The forensic processing of Peter Seams' abandoned vehicle yielded a treasure trove of evidence that would ultimately prove to be the linchpin of the investigation. Crime scene technicians meticulously dusted the interior and exterior of the car for latent prints. In the era before touch DNA and rapid digital processing, fingerprint analysis was the gold standard of forensic identification. Technicians discovered several distinct latent prints on the interior door handles and the steering wheel. One print, a clear thumbprint, was lifted with exceptional clarity. Additionally, investigators found a strand of hair that did not belong to the victim, preserving it for microscopic analysis. While the forensic team worked tirelessly in the laboratory, the suspect remained active. In late July, the remains of Troy Burris, a 50-year-old sausage delivery man, were discovered in a wooded area in Marion County. Troy was a beloved family man, known for his cheerful demeanor and his dedication to his delivery route. He had vanished while working, his delivery truck found parked on the side of a busy state road. The forensic examination confirmed the tragic pattern: fatal injuries from a .22 caliber weapon. Just weeks later, in September, the crisis deepened with the discovery of Charles Humphreys, a 56-year-old retired United States Air Force major and a former state child abuse investigator. Charles had dedicated his life to serving his country and protecting the vulnerable. His loss sent shockwaves through the community of public servants. He was found in Marion County, having suffered the same fate as the previous victims. The final known victim in this tragic sequence was Walter Antonio, a 60-year-old reserve police officer and security guard. Walter was a man who understood the risks of the world and was trained in personal safety. Yet he, too, fell victim to the highway predator in November of 1990. His remains were located in Dixie County, and his vehicle was recovered days later in another jurisdiction. The loss of a man with law enforcement training underscored the deceptive and highly effective nature of the perpetrator's methodology. The cumulative impact of these 7 lives lost was devastating. 7 families were left to navigate the profound grief of unexpected and violent loss. The victims were fathers, grandfathers, veterans, and hard-working citizens. The community demanded justice, and the pressure on the task force was immense. Investigators knew that the key to solving the case lay in the forensic evidence recovered from Peter Seam's vehicle and the composite sketches of the 2 women. The critical turning point in the investigation relied on a combination of old-fashioned detective work and forensic database technology. Detectives hypothesized that the suspects, having stolen personal items from the victims, would likely attempt to liquidate those items for cash. The task force initiated a massive canvassing operation, visiting pawn shops across Central Florida. They cross-referenced the inventory of missing items, such as tools, cameras, and jewelry, with recent pawn shop transactions. In 1990, pawn shops were required by law to record the identity of the seller and, crucially, to obtain a right thumbprint on the pawn ticket. This regulatory requirement became the ultimate downfall of the perpetrator. Detectives discovered a pawn ticket for a camera that had belonged to Richard Mallory. The ticket was signed by a woman using the name Cammie Marsh Green, and it bore a clear right thumbprint. The Forensic Identification Division immediately compared the thumbprint on the pawn ticket to the latent print recovered from the steering wheel of Peter Seam's wrecked Pontiac. The comparison was a perfect match. The investigators now had a direct forensic link between the stolen property of one victim and the stolen vehicle of another. The next step was to identify the woman using the alias Cammie Marsh Green. By running the thumbprint through the state and national fingerprint databases, a process that was becoming increasingly sophisticated with the advent of the automated fingerprint identification system, investigators uncovered the true identity of their suspect. The prints belonged to Aileen Wuornos, an individual with an extensive history of transient living and prior encounters with the legal system. Further investigation into Aileen Wuornos' background revealed that she frequently traveled with a companion named Tyria Moore. The descriptions of Wuornos and Moore perfectly matched the composite sketches generated from the witnesses at the scene of the Peter Seam's car crash. The task force finally had their targets. Locating 2 transient individuals with no fixed address required strategic intelligence gathering. Law enforcement utilized confidential informants and monitored areas known to be frequented by transient populations along the interstate corridors. In early January of 1991, undercover officers located Aileen Wuornos at a rural establishment known as the Last Resort in Volusia County. Understanding the potential danger and the necessity of a peaceful apprehension, a specialized tactical team executed the arrest without incident. Wuornos was taken into custody on outstanding warrants, providing the task force with the time they needed to build the larger case. Shortly after Wuornos was apprehended, investigators located Tyria Moore in Pennsylvania, where she had fled following the escalation of the crimes. Detectives approached Moore with the reality of the situation. They explained the overwhelming forensic evidence and the gravity of the charges being prepared. Moore, realizing the severity of the circumstances, agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. The investigative strategy shifted to obtaining a confession. Law enforcement arranged for Moore to make a series of monitored telephone calls to Wuornos, who was being held in the county jail. Under the guidance of detectives, Moore expressed intense distress, telling Wuornos that the police were closing in on her and that she was facing severe legal consequences for crimes she did not commit. The psychological dynamic between the two women proved to be the catalyst for the resolution of the case. Driven by a desire to protect her companion from prosecution, Wuornos made statements during the recorded phone calls that deeply implicated herself in the highway incidents. Eventually, realizing that the evidence was insurmountable and that Moore was safe from prosecution, Wuornos waived her rights and provided a full confession to the investigators. However, the confession came with a significant caveat that would form the basis of a complex legal battle. Wuornos admitted to causing the fatal injuries to the 7 men, but she vehemently claimed that each incident was an act of self-defense. She asserted that the men, who had engaged her for illicit highway transactions, had attempted to inflict severe physical harm upon her, and that she had utilized her firearm solely to protect her own life. The task force now faced the challenge of dismantling the self-defense claim using objective forensic science and logical deduction. The prosecution team, led by seasoned state attorneys, prepared for a trial that would capture the attention of the nation. The first trial focused specifically on the passing of Richard Mallory, the first known victim. The courtroom proceedings were a masterclass in forensic presentation and legal strategy. The defense argued that Wuornos, living a highly vulnerable life on the margins of society, was subjected to extreme danger and reacted as any person would when faced with a threat to their life. They painted a picture of a desperate individual fighting for survival in the dangerous environment of the highway underground. The prosecution, however, methodically deconstructed this narrative. They relied heavily on the physical evidence and the behavioral inconsistencies in Wuornos' account. The core of the prosecution's argument rested on the concept of premeditation and the profit motive. They pointed out that in every single instance, Wuornos had not only neutralized an alleged threat, but had also stolen the victims' vehicles, their money, and their personal belongings, subsequently selling those items at pawn shops. The systematic nature of the robberies heavily contradicted the premise of spontaneous self-defense. Furthermore, the forensic ballistics evidence proved devastating to the defense's case. Firearms experts testified regarding the trajectory and placement of the ballistic injuries sustained by Richard Mallory. The medical examiner provided detailed anatomical evidence demonstrating that the angles of the injuries were inconsistent with a struggle or a defensive posture. Instead, the forensic reconstruction suggested that the victim was attacked by surprise, offering no opportunity to defend himself or pose a threat to the perpetrator. The prosecution also highlighted the sheer statistical improbability of Wuornos' claim. While it was acknowledged that transient individuals face significant dangers on the streets, the assertion that 7 consecutive encounters over a 12-month period all resulted in life-threatening situations requiring lethal force defied logic. The jury was presented with the reality that Wuornos had armed herself, actively sought out isolated encounters, and executed a consistent pattern of violence and theft. Psychological evaluations also played a role in the broader understanding of the case. While Wuornos was deemed legally competent to stand trial, mental health professionals provided insights into her background. She had experienced a childhood marked by profound instability, neglect, and trauma. This psychosocial history offered a tragic context for her development, but did not meet the legal threshold for an insanity defense. The court maintained focus on her cognitive ability to understand the nature and consequences of her actions, and her efforts to conceal the crimes demonstrated a clear awareness of guilt. After hearing weeks of testimony, analyzing the forensic reports, and weighing the legal definitions of self-defense and premeditated harm, the jury deliberated. They returned a verdict of guilty in the case of Richard Mallory. The forensic evidence, the pawn shop receipts, and the pattern of calculated theft had completely eclipsed the narrative of self-defense. Following the conviction for the first case, the legal proceedings for the subsequent victims took a different path. Recognizing the overwhelming weight of the evidence and the precedent set by the Mallory trial, Wuornos eventually entered pleas of no contest or guilty to the remaining charges. The judicial system, taking into account the severity, the premeditation, and the sheer number of victims, handed down multiple sentences of the ultimate penalty. The conclusion of the legal proceedings brought a measure of closure to the families of Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burris, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. The victims were remembered not merely as statistics in a high-profile case, but as decent men who were deeply missed by their communities. The trials ensured that their legacies were honored through the pursuit and achievement of justice. Aileen Wuornos spent over a decade within the maximum security confines of the state correctional system. During this time, her case continued to be a subject of intense study by criminologists, sociologists, and legal scholars. The case forced a re-evaluation of the behavioral indicators used by law enforcement, proving that the capacity for systemic, organized violence was not exclusive to any single demographic. It also highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in the highway system and the dangers faced by both motorists and transient populations. In October of 2002, the legal appeals process reached its conclusion, and the sentences handed down by the courts were carried out. The final chapter of the highway tragedies was closed, but the impact of the investigation left a lasting mark on the criminal justice system. The forensic breakthroughs achieved during this investigation laid the groundwork for modern interagency cooperation. The successful utilization of the automated fingerprint identification system demonstrated the absolute necessity of shared national databases. Today, the processing of a latent print from a stolen vehicle or a pawn shop ticket occurs in a fraction of the time it took in 1990, allowing law enforcement to identify and apprehend suspects before they can escalate their activities. Furthermore, the case emphasized the vital importance of meticulous crime scene preservation. The single thumbprint lifted from the steering wheel of Peter Seams' vehicle, combined with a regulatory signature at a local business, formed the unbreakable chain of evidence that dismantled a series of crimes that might otherwise have remained unsolved. It stands as a testament to the dedication of the crime scene technicians, the persistence of the detectives, and the rigorous standards of the judicial system. As we reflect on the facts of this extensive investigation, the forensic science that brought the truth to light, and the tragic loss of 7 lives along the quiet stretches of the Florida interstate, we are left to consider the broader implications for our society. The highway remains a symbol of travel and connection, but it also demands our vigilance. When the safety of the open road is compromised, how do we balance our natural inclination to help a stranger with the imperative to protect ourselves in an unpredictable world?